Catherine Richards is an internationally known for artwork exploring the volatile sense of ourselves as new technologies shift our boundaries. Her work often crosses disciplines, and this project is undertaken in collaboration with the Cardiac Transplant Program at the Toronto General Hospital. International and national exhibitions include Sydney Biennale, ISEA, AV Festival, ACM SIGGRAPH, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, V2, SPECTROPIA, the National Gallery of Canada, ZKM. Awards include the Canada Council for the Arts Media Art Prize. Fellowships include the National Gallery of Canada and AIRS at the National Research Council of Canada. Grants include the Canada Council of the Arts, AT&T Canada, and the Daniel Langlois Foundation for the Arts, Science and Technology. And her work has been discussed by major theorists such as Katherine Hayles, Francis Tyson and Dot Tuer. She's professor at the University, Research Chair, Visual Arts at the University of Ottawa. Without further ado, Catherine Richards.
Thanks, Melinty. I didn't really expect you to read all of that. But I first want to thank Videopool and specifically yourself and co-curator Tom. Also the staff at Videopool, who I had the pleasure of meeting last night, and your collaboration with the director of Actuel Contemporary, Alex. It was a brilliant exhibition, great conception. I also want to mention that I'm very glad to be here in the company of the talented artists and speakers that we've had today. It's the advantage of going last because you've covered, I think, the territory in terms of disasters and age of catastrophe much better than I can do it. It's terrific. And I'm glad to be here on Treaty 19, the homeland of the Métis. This is a stereo image. It's actually very old-fashioned technology. And it's, I call it commingling, and I'll talk about these stereo pieces later on in the discussion. These are pieces that did come out of the collaboration and research project with the cardiac team at the Peter Munk Center. But first I thought I would talk a little bit about the piece that's in the exhibition. So the heart is a very, very unique tissue. It's the only tissue in the body that can hold a charge. The heart, and that's the heartbeat itself. This piece, it's wireless. When you pick it up, you can feel a beat because you're actually in an electromagnetic field. The heart's evacuated. It's a vacuum inside. It's filled with phosphorescent gases. It has an electrode. And when you pick it up, the physicist would say it excites. That's what it's doing to those phosphorescent gases. And I like the slippery language between the language of physics and the language of emotions, which of course is very appropriate for this extremely loaded image of the heart, which I have to say I was dragged reluctantly towards because it's so hard to unpack. This is the vacuum physicist I work with, Peter Sewell. He's fantastic. He's in his later on 80s now, lives in a little tiny house up on the shores of the Ottawa River, far enough out of the city, about an hour and a half, so he can see the northern lights. He's got this beautiful little basement lab that he explores ozone layers with, and I'm bringing him a great bottle of scotch from Scotland. This is our first prototype, and I got started on this because I was getting really annoyed at the discussion, this would be the early 90s, about virtuality. It was often used as a term to imply that virtuality was beyond materiality and therefore beyond critique. So I thought, well, what's the substance behind all this? And a lot of our new technology is somewhat relieved with Paul's talk to hear that quantum computers were still using electromagnetics to some degree. So that's sort of the substrate of, to a certain degree, electromagnetics of our new technology. Turns out we are electromagnetic as well, and certainly we know a lot about the heart, or they know a lot about the heart and how that charge works. But we're increasingly plugging into electromagnetic fields. I mean, initially radio, television, all sorts of fields were setting up for surveillance, but now wireless, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi. So we're immersed in a much, much deepening sea. So I wanted to some degree to show the kind of power, fragility, and danger of this force that we're dealing with. And we usually disguise it by our extremely cute little devices that Apple is so well known for. So L'Intrus, which is intruder, was extracted from this piece, which is an early piece called Charged Hearts, which I really built to, in effect, get a sense of what plugging into these forces might mean, which is what we're doing most of the time. And so I thought it was worthwhile to describe this piece a little bit first. It was commissioned by the National Gallery. You'll see that it's on a glass floor. And one of the reasons I really wanted it to be in the gallery was that, in a way, the 19th century kind of spectator is classic to a gallery. I mean, we go in there, we know exactly how to behave, we know the protocols, we know where we begin and end, we know who's the subject, who's the object. And so initially you can approach this piece that way. And in a sense, the spectator is sort of the site of my work. But to actually engage with the piece, you have to trespass against all those protocols. You have to step up on the glass. You actually have to put your hands in those cabinets, and you can pick up the heart like you do in the gallery here. And they beat, and once they start beating, that little torella, which means little world, starts to excite in the middle. Let's see. It's a little bit of a close-up. So this little torella, that's the close-up where you can see the torella in the middle. So at one point I'm talking about the kinds of technologies and fields that we generate ourselves, but of course there's a natural electromagnetic field, and that is what comes from the sun in solar flares and hits our upper atmosphere and actually creates the northern and southern lights. The Norwegian Birkeland was the first person that experimentally showed how that works, and his work inspired this little object. And ironically, if we can think back to before our flat panels, that's how our television sets worked. If you took those boxes apart, you'd see a big glass bottle with an electrode at the bottom, and it's evacuated, and there's phosphors in the front. And that electron hits all those phosphors and creates an image. So I thought, in the spirit of disasters, I would recall, and I'm sorry, there's great images from NASA of the sun, but this one just happens to be what took place in 1989. The sun released a billion-ton cloud of gas, energy of thousands of nuclear bombs exploding at the same time. It came straight towards Earth at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and on Monday, March the 12th, a vast cloud of solar plasma, which is actually in that little heart you picked up, hit the atmosphere, and they could see the northern lights from, I'm sure Winnipeg you get great views of the northern light, but right down to Florida and Cuba. It also creates currents in the ground, and I've read accounts by telegraph operators when people really sent telegraphs, where when they were hit with solar storms, they could actually just take their wire and put it in the ground, and they could send telegraphs that way, so wireless messages. And on March the 13th, the currents found a weakness in the electrical power grid of Quebec. And in 2 minutes, the entire power grid lost power for 12 hours. I happened to go and visit electromagnetic lab just outside of Ottawa. They still remember that because they say up to that point, the government was laying off electromagnetic scientists quite a bit. And after that storm happened, they hired them back pretty quickly. So the second just associated kind of event was when this was installed in the appropriately named power plant gallery in Toronto. And we arrived in balmy Toronto. The hearts hadn't arrived yet. I give a call back to the National Gallery, and they said, the roads are closing, the trains are stopped, the planes are down. And as I was looking at these little towers of mine, we began to see these kind of images. It was the ice storm of 1998. Freakish water droplets had froze almost instantly on contact and encased 100,000 square meters in ice. Hydro pythons toppled. These are high voltage systems that come down from northern Quebec. Entire forests collapsed under the weight of ice. Trees fell through roofs, bridges buckled, power lines came down. It was the biggest blackout in North American history. Estimated 4 million people were affected, mostly around Ottawa and Montreal. And what I didn't remember till I looked this up was that the largest deployment of Canadian forces since the Korean War was undertaken in an effort to relieve the beleaguered communities. Back to charged hearts. This kind of gear that was underneath the floor, of course, can now be all kind of collapsed in a couple little boxes. And we didn't neglect the virtual in this particular piece. We got a little bit crazy, actually. When you picked up a glass heart, this printer would spit out a little fake charge card with your unique number on it. And we had a game online, which was taking up the kind of emotional conceit of the heart. And just to give you a sense of the vintage of this, you can see Netscape up there. And this was with Martin Snellgrove, who was my co-creator on it. And here he is in the copper room. He was a research chair at Carleton University in his lab. And this was a Java-based real-time game. So the only way to get it to run remotely real-time was to have these just little pulsing hearts that could change color, considering their health. I could say, Valenti, are you part of a Charge Hearts game? He said, oh yeah, sure. And I said, well, I want to bring you into my simulation. I like you. So he would give me his name, like Catastrophe. I'd type it in. And his heart beating at a certain rate would come into the simulation. And there was only one rule. If I brought someone into my little emotional world, it could influence my heart. But Valenti didn't have to ask me back into his simulation, for example. And since he seems like a very nice guy, I thought, oh, I'll move his heart closer to mine. But, he's got lots of people in his life. He put my heart quite a bit farther in his simulation. So I'd always be trying to get closer to him, and he'd always be trying to get away, so pursuit. And I didn't know that he had extensive woebegone friends. He would drag the other hearts in here, and then the hearts started to affect each other. They could get healthier, get overexcited. They had catastrophic heart attacks, and if you died in your own simulation, you died in others. But you could run down and pick up the heart and get a charge card and rush, now you could put on your phone, and give yourself a charge. And we had it when I was at the power plant. If you're online, your heart could get, and someone picked up the heart, you could get healthier and younger, though people started to go prenatal. It's a bit of a problem. And I hadn't thought about this game for quite a long time, and then we just got asked by Scotland if they'd come over and rebuild it. There wasn't enough time, but they had a whole gamer jam going on. So we described the whole game. So all these kids made these amazing projects. And here they are doing selfies because the gallery gave a prize to them all. So I ended up making a bunch of pieces that in effect talked about being immersed in this electromagnetic sea. Some of them basically plugged you in, like the heart, and some of them protected you. For example, this one, I called it the Cabinet of Curiosities at the end of the millennium. Because now if you want to unplug, you're the curio. So the spectator would get in the cabinet, close the door, your cell phone doesn't work. You're protected from TV, radio waves, and so forth. But unless you're very rich and have lots of secrets, that's very exceptional. This was another one that basically plugged you in because we know a bit about how the brain works electromagnetically. You actually touched it and you actually created a field, and this one was a follow-up of the cabinet where you got, it's really for me the end of the 90s, the image of the end of the 90s where we couldn't decide, our technologies, is it a body bag or is it the post-human? Specters came in, you could sign up, and two women would come out and unwrap this incredibly gorgeous copper fabric and wrap you up in it, and there you were for, I would say, at least 20 minutes. For most of us, it's the first time we've been unplugged. And I'm just going through some images of things because we'll move on. So other pieces I did, including a patent back with Martin, which is a kind of peer-to-peer virus as opposed to the cloud that we heard about earlier, trying to look at how that sense of data control and basically sensing and how that matching can happen on a peer-to-peer basis rather than a top-down basis. It's when it was installed in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. I thought I was finished with hearts, but hearts were apparently not finished with me. So I'm going to describe why I harvested or extracted blood through from charged hearts. I was invited to be part of this heart transplant team. Pat McGeever, who's a health sociologist, one of the most kind of inspired people around putting interdisciplinary symposium together, had asked me to symposium a few years earlier, and she was put together this team to do research on heart transplants, consisting of cardiologist, psychiatrist, philosopher of embodiment, and a health sociologist. So in a way, it was bringing the interests of mine and my other pieces about where we begin and end and the new technologies right into the flesh. Where do you begin and end when you have someone else's heart inside you? They asked for artists, 2 from Canada, 2 from the UK. So this is the hospital. Now, the medical team, and I don't know how they twigged to this exactly, they thought they detected some level of distress with successfully transplanted patients, even though they scored high on quantitative scales, such as they can climb the stairs without running out of breath, for example. They can do most of the things they did before. So they conducted a series of long video interviews with patients in their homes with a very empathetic grad student, and they were very evocative. And if you read a transcription of what they said, you would think things are fine. You would say, thank you, how could I ever thank you enough? I can do all these things that I never could do before. It's really the gift of life. But when you watch the video, things change. Patient would often be sitting down, they'd often be surrounded by a lot of bottles, pills, and they would say it's the same thing, but they would go, thank you. I don't know how to thank you. I'm twisting a little paper clip back and forth. So all the body language and the tone of the voice exhibit great distress, and they found in their study about 80% of their patients to some degree were distressed. They also said some very interesting things. And we had ethical clearance to see these videos, such as I always spontaneously say we now instead of I, or I used to be really neat, now I'm really messy, or I don't care, it's just a pump, I don't care. And then you find out that they searched every microfilm in the library and decided it was a mafioso gangster who was shot in the streets of Toronto, and that's who their heart came from. The more I got involved in the project, the more implications were revealed. And maybe everybody knows this, but I didn't. It's changed when we consider a human dead. When hearts are taken, that heart has to be alive. A donor is called alive dead. A dead heart can't be put in a new body. So it shifted that line. Now, Ingrid Bachmann was the other artist from Canada, and she led a SSHRC grant around this called Hybrids. And the first thing I decided to do, since reaching back to my Charged Hearts project, it seemed very appropriate, and we were showing the medical team the kind of work that we do. So that's when I decided I'd go back to the body of Charged Hearts, and in their kind of language, they harvest the heart. Now, one of the things that impressed me about this team, and one of the reasons I wanted to work with them as well, is I found they were very brave, really. I mean, these are people that are working quite close with very sick and desperate people, and yet they asked a lot of hard questions about what they were doing. And one of the things they said along the way was, when we ask the people to sign a consent form, we don't say, and you'll have a different identity. They pointed me to a French philosopher, Jean-Luc Nancy, who wrote an essay because he had a heart transplant. And as you can see, I basically took the title of the piece from his essay. He says, though many serious illness entail a confrontation with death, only in the case of heart transplant do patients know their life-saving operation was enabled by the death of another human being, part of whose body resides in them. Cardiologists expressed it like a feeling of being tethered, that every heartbeat reminds them of that. But Nancy goes further. He discusses the suppression of the immune system. So it's not just having a living object in your living body that's somehow tied together. It is suppression of the systems which he identifies with identity. So he identifies your immune system to your sense of identity. And obviously, if your own immune system defends you as it's designed to do, it will kill the new heart and kill you both. So sort of part 2 of this. In the background to all this, I occasionally went to visit the cardiologist, Dr. Heather Ross's office. Now, it was filled with little trinkets, little heart trinkets, little tokens that, well, they were everywhere. Windows, bookshelves, desks. I was fascinated, but I really didn't know what to think about it. And eventually I asked her about them. And you keep in mind that patients do not come and see her in her office. They see her in clinic. And it turns out successful heart transplantation patients seemingly spontaneously come to that clinic year after year. Some people are still living after 10 years, and they give her these little worthless little trinkets, which are piling up in her office, in her drawers. And I can point to one, and she can tell me the story of that person who gave it to her. And she can't get rid of them. And I think on some level, we probably all understand why she can't. But the more I was around, the more I thought, what's happening? Like, they don't belong here. This is like the modernist hospital. These things, what are they doing here? It's like they crept through the cracks of this structure. And at the same time, I really didn't want to deal with these they were like little tacky little things. And, a contemporary art mode, it's kind of toxic to a contemporary art mode, unless you bracket them in some way, in a postmodern way, quote them or do a pop art thing, because they appear too sentimental. And, as I said, this team is dealing with life and death issues and desperate moments in some cases, and it just seemed to be wrong to do that. Originally, I thought perhaps her office is a shrine. This is a photograph of votives that I found in a shop window. Votives are given by the penitent to unfathomable forces. To me, it's a recognition that there are forces that are beyond control. It's a plea, not to a person. And here they all are in her office. So I really didn't think they were that either. And so eventually I relented, and I asked if I could borrow them, not knowing what I would do. I was told by the team she was anxious when she heard about the request. I thought, this makes it more interesting. She let me have them. I took them back to my studio. Now, simultaneously, I was leading a research project underway, investigating objects and agency, because I thought these issues would really challenge my art practice. It had long fermentation period. Years ago, I was influenced by Jell's book on art and agency, and Maureen Matthews, who's a curator here at the Museum of Manitoba, and I'd started conversations on what would become, as she called it, the personhood of objects. She's worked a lot with the Pangasi in northern Manitoba, and for example, writing their language, like in French, you have a language that's gendered. In Cree, you have a language where actually the grammar denotes whether an object is animate or inanimate. So just as people can become objects in certain relations, can objects have person-like qualities? Can they appear to have minds of their own? So while I was considering this within art, her thinking was very much developing with museum objects, and we teamed up with Maria Lanton, who runs a research sector at Emily Carr, who's looking at virtual objects. And looking back, I think I might not have pursued these little objects without our conversations. Here are the first things I made for the agency project. I made them really big, 12 by 12, 10 by 10, 6 by 6, and they're old-fashioned phantograms, so they're on the floor. The images appear to go in the ground, above the ground. They're negative stereo with a nod to medical images, and in stereo they seem to have a half-life. Not exactly material or not exactly immaterial. I also interviewed her initially, and at the beginning I did put some text on. So, why do you give me this? I'm afraid to ask. And they were first showing something else in Mexico at this festival. Joanna Selinsky from Goldsmith was organizing a really amazing festival with a great symposium on life. So it was kind of in the air. And another quote on one was, please cut me open, will I wake up? Really a fantastic, this was an old convent. We were able to put them in. And through the Hybrids project, they organized a show at PHI in Montreal. And this is the first time the medical team saw these works. I've been sending 2D images, but they hadn't seen them in stereo. And you can see how they're on the floor here. This is a picture of Dr. Ross and myself. We're laughing, I think, because at that point, she had been looking at those big pieces, and she discovered that by kind of moving up and down, she could make the heart beat, and she got a whole bunch of people to do it. Plus she said, why is it cyan and red? And I went on about how this is the way to print stereo, and she says, well, those are the colors of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. The hands on the left are Dr. Susan Abbey, who's the heart transplant psychiatrist. She's taking a picture. She's taking a picture of this. The top right-hand heart, which is a plastic key ring, which is like this big. And she says, oh, I know, that's so-and-so who gave you this, and he's having a hard time. Takes out her camera, takes the pictures, I'm going to take it back to him and show it to him. So I'm beginning to wonder what's going on. Before this, just before the exhibition, I started printing some small ones. These are like 12 inches by 12 inches. And I thought I'd show 2 on the wall. But I thought, you know, how am I going to communicate that I didn't go to the store and buy these little trinkets? These belong to Dr. Ross. So I emailed her and said, can you identify these in any way? She sent me back an email with things like JS, the initials, 4 months, 2 days, PD, 10 years. She could look at them and say, oh, that's Adrian Dexter, who survived 10 years after transplant. That's what she was indicating. I was going to write on them, and then I thought, well, they're going to be at the opening. Why am I writing on them? This was like a week before. And then I thought, why shouldn't it be a little performance, little last-minute performance? And I contacted her, and she said, would you mind? She said yes, and apparently the team was astonished, because she was actually one of the more skeptical people of asking artists on that team. Like, usually I'm the one, you know, knocking on the scientist's door. This was exceptional when they asked for artists to be involved. So I just want to say, and I'll say it again, any video that I show with Dr. Ross, I've asked her permission, and specifically each time I ask her permission. And it was a very busy, you'll hear, a very busy crammed show, something like actual contemporary. Now, the last one that you just saw, she turns to me in the middle of the signing and says, "This person is dying." And I said, "Do you want to indicate that in some way?" And she underlines the initials at the bottom. Now, the medical group of about 5, amongst that noisy, crammed, they were all around that signing event, and they became totally silent, and the temperature just completely changed. I knew something major was happening, but I had no idea really what. I just felt I had trespassed somehow. And it was drastic, and they probably would never talk to me again. And I noticed there was, in the after party afterwards, they all left early. The next day we were giving a talk. Had a panel discussion, artist and some of the medical team. And beforehand she sat down next to me and she said, "That person died last night." So I thought I better go to Toronto as soon as possible and talk to them, but it took 2 to 3 months before we could get times lined up. And I talked to 3 of them when I got there. They said they'd all walked the streets of Montreal that night. And so when I went to talk to Dr. Ross, initially when I did the interviews, I was like behind the camera, and these videos were not intended really to show. I was just shooting them for my own interest and research. But I thought at this point, I'm embroiled, connected, bound by all this as much as anybody else here, so I'm in the video as well.
Of all times, at all moments.
Oh, that had to happen then.
That happened at that moment.
Well, especially for sure, because, right, we follow, I've listed hundreds and hundreds of patients. We've transplanted hundreds of patients since I've been here. And I've had, hundreds of patients give me things. Mm-hmm. So to have the individual give me something that you chose of all the things you took to put in your picture, because there were lots of trinkets, and you chose that one to put in your picture.
And I chose those 2 shots.
All the shots, you choose those 2 shots. So that's the sort of stuff that makes you
shiver.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, that our art and agency project was called Shivering. So what is the object here? I'm still in the middle of this, so I'm still sorting it out. Is it the dead heart? Is the alive heart? The dead body? The new alive? The tokens? The image? Whatever it was pretty determined to talk. But let's go on.
At the end of the day, I'm not sure whether I want to thank you or kill you. I mean that in the nicest of ways, but maybe I should have said thank you or shoot you. Sounds a little better. I think it is still raw. I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's been much more powerful than I expected, and in some respects, as I've tried to explain, it's been magnified more than the very original giving of the heart, right, of the whatever the gift is they've given me. It's been
the actual token.
The actual token. So there's the token, there's the looking after the patient, there's the emotion of that, and then, as I said, and then the watching the interviews, and then this, which has been, it's been magnified. No question about it. So it's been, I am truly grateful for the experience. I don't want you to take it the wrong way at all, but I feel a little bit like I have looked in Pandora's box now.
Yeah.
I guess that's, a
Yeah.
terribly
That's what I was.
well overused metaphor, but I actually think that's a bit of what it's been
Yeah.
like.
And I have a lot of respect for Pandora's box being closed.
Yeah.
A lot of times.
Well, right now I'm jumping up and down, and there's stuff that's actually leaking out,
Yeah.
and the clasp isn't on,
Yeah.
and I'm actually trying to jump down on it to actually
Right.
close it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I never. Right.
So just FYI, that's sort of what the whole experience has been like in a nutshell.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So from this experience, I would have to say, certainly tentatively, objects that kind of have person-like qualities. They can appear to have minds of their own. Surprisingly, the medical team wants to continue. I feel like we're just in the middle. So I'm looking for a way to do that. But I think, this little story of something that's happening in such an intimate kind of way, I can take on some of the themes, I think, of the symposium that have been so well addressed before me. Singular accidents, catastrophes, Latour's quasi-objects. Maybe, C talks about the self as seen as one with others as opposed to self-other binary. I think the feeling I get from a lot of the discussion is that philosophers and theorists who seem to be warning us that something has to change to avoid if we're going to have more or less a self-inflicted catastrophe. Now, I'm neither a theorist nor a philosopher, so I take up Virgilio's surfing thing. I just surf over that part, picking and choosing what seems to fit. But in talking to David just before, resurrecting the notion of paradigm shift, it does seem to be being suggested that we need to do that. And that's my best guess. I mean, this is 2 to 3 months after Dr. Russ is feeling this painfully. At the same time, I feel like we're caught in a structure, the hospital, the medical relationships, the modern division of what can be allowed in or out. As Latour observes, faith in modernization no longer rings quite true in art or economics or politics or science or technology or in art galleries and concert halls. You can feel the heart is gone. And Dot Tuer, Toronto theorist, points out, in a contemporary context, as our bodies become increasingly entangled with technology, the boundaries between materiality and immateriality, what is visible, what is invisible, are as leaky and indeterminate as they were 500 years ago, pre-modern. I've always said what's after postmodern is pre-feudal, which I think Paul alluded to as well. Latour has sometimes says it in a slightly more positive way. We've been modern very well. We can no longer be modern in the same way. So we're looking for a new shift, a new paradigm for the relation of human, non-human, people, objects, new kinds of objects, the relations, whatever they are. In this case, we can be very specific. But I often feel we're unprepared, and it can be painful to live it as the medical team and the patients do, and where you are really living it, it's not theoretical. And what of the fable of Pandora's box, I don't even know where to go with it. Are we loosening more evils, including our own, or is it a way to rework the modern world? Oh, thank you.
This is the second time I'm actually seeing a project with where artists are working with the heart at institutes dedicated to transplant surgery or researching of the heart, etc. In Australia, there is Patricia Adams, who works with the heart, and her project and we exhibited her at Plug-in with another project for the exhibition Toxicity. But I became aware that the heart cells, if you would lay them down individually, they would start working in a rhythm, and they would group together, and they would jump up and down as a heart, no matter how many you put down, and it just their function was that. So I sort of started to realize that this was a unique organ, in the sense that the others didn't have those capabilities. And now I'm also seeing that uniqueness once again in your work, where the patients are aware that, as you said, the heart belonged to another patient who is no longer living, that they're having someone else's heart. The doctors are obviously aware of that. As we saw, the doctor at the end was quite emotional about the patient who had died. Do you think that this is is the work with heart different to everything else you have worked with? Is it so different?
I mean, originally when I talked about charged heart, I was attracted to it because I wanted to see if scientists had actually worked out how living things can thrive, exist in electromagnetic fields, because we're deepening those rapidly. And at that point, we knew very little. But we knew a lot about the heart, and it's called a special tissue. It's called excitable tissue. And in terms of our vice president of research actually does research on heart cells, and she told me too about, you could take cells from multiple rats and put them on a slide, and they'll all sort of sync up. So I went to her lab to see this happening. But I think, for me, there were several interesting things about this iteration, which is, it's in such a modernist context, and technology is what allows us to do these incredibly violent things to our bodies, hopefully for the good, where, we literally take a heart out of someone else, and heart that's still beating, and put it into someone else's body. And it brings up all these things we talk about theoretically, like, hybridity, that's maybe a good thing to think about. Yet it's, once people try to live that in a kind of, in the material world, and it's the action of the material world, things become a lot more complicated. And if we follow Latour, the edges of, we've never been modern in the book, certainly parts I can follow. Those lines that divide the hospital from other things and makes it possible that we can do those things to ourselves are obviously artificial. And what happens when those lines start to get pretty leaky? He's claiming that that's a better thing to do, that maybe they get leaky, we'll start to have other relationships with other objects that we think are exterior to us, like climate change, which isn't exterior to us, right? That we objectify. So I'm not exactly answering your question, but I think those were the things that drew me to it.
Monica, you think you had a question?
Yes, I was actually, thank you for your presentation. I was actually wondering about, I'm very interested in this process of when you're dealing with very delicate, matter, and then how you transform it into something artistic or some art. And you always have to deal with this, violence through symbolization, which I think what happened at the exhibition, right? You wanted to sort of, in some way, not single out, but almost gently, let people know that this person is somehow distinct from others. But the symbol of underlining this person's name came across as pure violence, right? Because this person died. And also when you were saying about this heart tokens and in what way to represent them, in what way to contextualize them, in what way to express what they're meaning in the world in a way. And so I was just wondering, as an artist, do you struggle, because Melinki was talking about Bergson and intuition, and I think Bergson intuition was exactly that against symbolization. That his
Against
intuition-
which?
Against symbolization.
Symbolization.
Yeah, symbolization, yeah. And basically that this sympathy can only come from something that cannot be symbolized or like be traced through symbols. So,
Yeah, I'd have to probably go back and read Bergson exactly, but let me just respond to the first part. I think I wasn't trying to be an advocate for the patients. I think what struck me with these little trinkets was the kind of, I mean, this was something, as far as I understand, because I don't get to meet them. It's ethically not possible. So you're kind of reading it through a, distance. It's a kind of failure of the modernist structure that this kind of spontaneous ritual comes about. Like something is missing in how this takes place. That this comes forward. That's not taken into account. And so I think I was drawn to that. I mean, you just have to go step by step. I know if I knew the solution at the beginning, to see, okay, then where does it go? Is it going to basically, I mean, we were talking about this at break, like, how do you deal with this materiality when this stuff gets, I don't know how to express it actually. The patients have created this kind of little material thing, but as an artist, we're quite used to having odd objects in the creative process, not necessarily in a gallery situation, but during the creative process, and we all, during crits, you hear this all the time, in this kind of strange seclusion of crits in art school. We have this like bizarre language, like, is the object talking to you? Are you listening to it? What is it? And some of the worst art comes when someone has this idea and they try to press it on the material world and not listen back, right? So I think we are fairly attuned to that. But if I think that's not the way we generally see objects in the world. We objectify the objects. And if I follow kind of Latour, is that we can't do that anymore. We have to look at these hybrid situations where they're carrying things that empirically we wouldn't consider, correct in the modern world. They're carrying other kinds of ways of speaking. I find it difficult because this is as far as I've got, in this project. So, but it's kind of a little laboratory in a way to see what happens. But I do see it as, people that are deeply involved in this conflicted kind of situation, doing this kind of almost ritual because something is really not working in there. And the fact that the team, and the fact that they responded that way, I think on some level recognize that.
I find myself finding an interesting parallel between what I feel like you're touching on here with respect to modern medicine and people in relationship to modern medicine, and what Paul was talking about with dark matter early on, the invisible 97% that we don't have the instruments to see, and it's there and it's massive, but we can't see it, and it's almost as though you're trying to infer the presence of the dark matter of modern medicine, the stuff that it doesn't have ways of containing, but it's there, and it doesn't have the tools to describe or respond to, and that haunted feeling that they had was the awareness of the presence, that's what's behind in Pandora's box, is all of everything else that we've hidden away because we've developed a very powerful process of dealing with things that has tangible success. And we have this sinking feeling that there are underlying failures that we do not understand and we have no way to even measure or respond to.
It's a little bit like the discussion we had before, which is, if we create a structure that works well, like modern medicine does work well in many, many ways, but how much do we get tied to that and how rigid does it get? And does it get so rigid to the point that instead of imperceptibly or in small steps, it gets modulated, or it waits for a catastrophe, quotes, to turn it. Yeah. I mean, that's what I want to go back and see, okay, I don't want to assume what's out of Pandora's box. And there's a feminist reading of Pandora's box too, so it gets quite complicated. Yeah, that's.
Can I just follow up? Oh, sorry. Sorry. I just, you continue, but I just want to follow up on what David said about the dark matter, about the unknown, right? About the unknown world. And maybe go back to Bergson again, because for the doctors, they know the hearts, right? They know the patients, they're working with that matter, it's their world. But you're an artist, you're parachuted into that world. You're not a doctor, you don't have the knowledge. So in Bergson's understanding, he says whenever we're faced with new objects, we have to, for every single object, we have to develop a new way of thinking. We cannot think always with the same way. Like a new method of thinking has to be developed for every single object. So that's impossible to do, right? So the tool, the vehicle that allows us to do that is intuition. So would you say that you have the artistic intuition to select that one object which then is realized by exhibiting it in the gallery space, but you have selected precisely the one object of the one patient that dies. So you have the intuition, the artistic intuition to go into this unknown world and select something we disturb the doctor afterwards, obviously.
Okay. Two different thoughts on that. One is when I did construct L'Entrue and took it to the medical team, the clinician picked it up, got excited, and she said, "Oh, this is exactly how they tell me they feel. They're the host, there's an energy source inside, and when they make major decisions, they talk to it like a separate something." So that's one. The other is, and this is where the interesting conversations came in with Maureen Matthews, because objects, and I mean, if she was here, she would give a very eloquent kind of answers, but objects that in the Pangasi area where she's been basically talking with the Cree can be animate and inanimate. It depends on their relationships with things, and they can change. So one of the stories that I heard from an anthropologist, for example, in Vancouver, was about a mask that a gallery had, a Kwakigul mask, and they were putting it up for a competition between, there were two cities in the States with football teams, and they were betting who was going to win, and whoever won got to use their sort of star object in their museum. And of course, this got back to the people who actually owned it, originally in BC, and they protested. And on one hand, you could look at that like, oh, that's a terrible thing for them to do. On the other hand, I could look at it like, hey, the object just wants to hitchhike getting home, and it decided this is the best way to do it. So if you follow the thought through, I'm still tentative on this, that objects can take on agency. It's that basically it hitchhiked on me. It saw me coming around and it said, oh, here's my chance. Here's my chance to get this talked about. That's just a different way of looking at it.
It's a good segue. I'm interested in the different ways of looking at catastrophe, and whether it be personal or on a grand scale. And there seems to be a real difference between people who experience it, and they don't have, and then the people who theorize about it and haven't experienced it. And that we kind of saw that in the last panel talking about that and how that's a very different thing. So the doctors are kind of, they have the theory, they have the equipment, they have this plan on how to fix this, and then there is the person that this is happening to, and how that unfolds intimately in their life, intimately and directly and horrifically, like every second of their day is involved in this. And I'm just really interested at how the object is the interstitial bridge between these two. It's like it starts to translate between the people and bring things together, and it's like an agent of something that happens next. And I just find that really interesting, and I'd like to hear more about objects as how they interact with us and are an agency, or help us as an agency to do something. How do they urge us to do something if we listen to them? That's all. I guess I don't know if that's a
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to figure this out myself, right? Because
Yeah.
sometimes then I feel like I don't have the language. Because suddenly you fall into this, like, what sounds like superstition,
Right.
or some romantic notion of the artist.
quickly, yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't seem correct either. But at the same time, such as Dot Tuer says, it's we can go back 500 years. I just had picked up a book on medieval superstition where, they were claiming they both understood it empirically, and in this particular case, it was the eclipse, as a sign. So you can have simultaneous kinds of reading in the same way that Maureen would say the object would have simultaneous numbers of relationships or not. So it's kind of new territory, I think. Yeah.
Fascinating things.
Wondering, maybe, I don't know too much about this, but maybe someone else in the audience or on the panels can talk to this, is that the object-oriented ontologies, and I can't.
I think I know it's there, but to me it's just another sign that, it's in the air. It's not just, oh, as they say. Or Bennett, is talking about that to a certain extent too. Latour talks about it. So it's kind of in the air theoretically.
And then also maybe the Internet of Things. I mean, there's
Yeah, to a certain extent, yeah.
This is sort of like philosophical stuff.
There's a certain, like in other cultures, the object plays a role in ceremonies around death, like the Katami. I think in Japan, when the gift is given, an object of the person given to another person. So they have this, but I'm interested in the abject nature of the body itself, in relationship to, like, because he's mentioning Bergson, and of course you've got the X-ray at the same time as a way of seeing inside the body, and maybe where we weren't meant to go, and our capability of comprehending the inside of ourselves as organisms and so on. And so the question is this sort of the relationship, like, of these objects to kind of familiarize ourselves with an abjectness that we can't deal with. In other words, the objects become symbolic of something safer to deal with the fact that we can't comprehend the certain things that are going on inside, like the patients can't comprehend, we can't comprehend. And I never ever try to think about like the fact that there's stuff inside going on. It's a kind of scary thought. It's all gluggy and stuff, and things going to happen all the time, and noises, and my God.
Oh, God.
The poet's understanding of the heart is interesting, though, because the poets tend to not see the heart as abject, but they rather see it as the mechanism, the object that holds the possibility always of either catastrophe or its resolution. I mean, I can just think offhand of George Herbert's line, "Batter my heart, three-person God," a poem that then finds its way to a kind of religious instrumentality, or Patrick Lane, how the heart stinks with its devotion. The poets tend, I think, to see the heart not in scientific terms, but in profoundly romantic terms, as a kind of a thing that in fact can resolve all the problems at the same time that it states them. And so I don't know that this refers to what you were saying, but I can't think of a poetic line that isn't about the excesses of the heart as a kind of emotional instrument that gets, it isn't scientific at all, it's profoundly romantic in the truest sense of the term.
The heart is definitely packed up, which is kind of why I was kind of drag kicking and screaming, to try to deal with this, because it's so packed already. And But the added twist is what happens when you have someone else's heart inside. You know, like we just assume, at least I'm assuming from a poetic point of view, I'm still talking about what I'm pretty confident is my heart, whatever that means in our culture, right?
The lover assumes that he or she has his or her, or depending on the nature of the relationship, heart inside, the other's heart inside their body too.
That's a good
how
point.
Art thinks of its devotion is about. It's about a kind of synchronicity of feeling because of the profundity of love. I mean, that's a trope. It's not, it has no basis in actual fact except for heart transfusion. I mean,
Heart transplant.
I've heard some things recently about hearts being synchronized with each other at a distance, like in terms of like a scientific conversation, that it didn't seem super substantial, but there was sort of, from numerous sources, little rumblings about this sort of romantic concept might actually have some kind of...
At Burning Man, that was one person, what they did is they brought a stethoscope, and then, or two stethoscopes, and people would time their hearts to sync their hearts together. So it does happen.
Well, we talked with Katherine about her installation at the actual gallery. So if you actually pick up the heart, then it could possibly synchronize with your heart, right? With your heartbeat.
And that's pure speculation, but there's no...
I love it, I'll take it as well.
Yeah, there's no reason, like it's... I know, scientists claim they can put solenoids in your head and, you know, entrain your neurons to feel certain emotions. So in theory, you could put your, you know, hold electromagnetic field and train your heartbeat, I guess. But...
well, there is Raphael's...
It's like we're very queasy about intimacy, the intimacy of it though. Like it's very funny how we can speak about this on a theoretical level and keep objects, so, you know, separate from us, but when in reality we're really so connected to them that we don't even know how closely we're connected.
And of course it's true of new technologies. I just didn't talk about that. I mean, we even, you know, our new technologies are very connected.
Where does one thing end and the other begin?
Yeah.
Could I ask one question?
Sure.
So you probably know the Ishiguro novel and movie Never Let Me Go, which does a kind of dystopian...
I don't actually.
You know, but it's a sort of dystopian take on transplants, but organ harvesting. So that, you know, there's like this class of people who are basically bred for their organs, so that they're, you know, they just live till, you know, the peak healthy age, and then they're put down and all their organs are harvested to their overseers, which raises the whole idea of hierarchy and power and social context of transplants. And I was wondering about because I don't know anything really about it, about the sort of list and the ordering of who gets a transplant, and if that came up in your research, how is that list created, that hierarchy? Is this a matter of matching people? Is there a certain age that they would just say, oh, that person's too old, we're not going to transplant that heart? I mean, there seems to be this really thick context around how people would be chosen and how the hierarchy, if you will, works. And so I was just interested to hear if you had come to any discovery.
Well, I did ask the psychiatrist if anybody had refused.
Yeah.
Because I thought it, you know, on some kind of grounds they might. And first of all, her first reaction, which was only like, I just caught her for a few minutes, was, yeah, the doctors send them to me. Right? But I asked her further later, and first of all, I get a little bit of clarity. I don't know the criteria, but there are a lot of hoops you have to go through before you get there, like your own doctor, family doctor, then specialist doctors, and then whatever the criteria is to see if you're valid, you know, if you're going to stand it, I guess, or what condition your own system's in. So to get up to that level. And the one story, there may be others that she did tell me, which took me aback, was a woman from a very well-off family in Toronto with quite a high-powered, significant other person. and 2 teenage kids, and she thought she was holding back the, whatever, I guess, social position that I guess it would be expected, and she refused the heart transplant, which was not the answer I ever expected. I thought, well, maybe there's someone who on religious grounds would say, well, God gave me this life, God takes it away, whatever, Just the act of like getting that other heart, which also, be interesting to look at the poetic thing, because in a way you feel like you're somehow chosen that lover to have that other heart. In this case, the way the structure's set up is that you have no idea where that other heart is. In fact, you're forbidden to get in touch with them. You write a letter, and that's it in our system, which may be part of the whole problem. Maybe that's the reason those little tokens, like there's something not fully human, fully something, fully dark matter, fully acknowledgement of the forces that we're dealing with that, that's at play here. And
so that's interesting, because it can have problems with concepts of privacy and privacy legislation, and especially doctors are taught that, they're definitely not supposed to express any sort of anything outside of the relationship between the patient and the doctor. And then with that great unknown and the dark matter and everything like that, and you start thinking about how privacy law is happening now, just not only within medicine, but just sort of outside, within the old sort of surveillance systems that we have everywhere. And going back to this sort of unknown, this great unknown, because everybody's, well, I would not say everybody, right? I'm generalizing, obviously, but there's an uncomfortableness of knowing and not knowing, and who knows and who doesn't know. So I'm going to stop there.
Well, that's fascinating. There could be a charter challenge. I don't think that will hold up. It doesn't hold up in the case of adoption. Adoptive children have the right to find out who their adoptive parents are. That's really, I had no idea that was the case, that there's and I don't know that signing would hold up actually in law with a challenge. I mean, maybe nobody would ever challenge it, but boy, that's really interesting.
well, on the other side, I think some of the donors don't want to connect. It's complicated.
When I hear about it in the States, it sort of seems like
It's different in the States.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a Radio Lab show recently about a mother who had twins, and one of them had some sort of serious defect and was given for transplant, and she decided she wanted to know what happened. It was a very powerful, fulfilling journey to go and even to see samples of her son in use, but to understand that this ramified out. There was something profoundly completing about that sounded very positive. And it does feel like, although there are clearly logical reasons why privacy needs to be protected, it does feel like it's a severing of connections that really need to be corrected for there to be some sort of completeness. I don't know.
They're doing another research project on donors, or actually a donor's family, obviously. I don't know. I mean, does it carry all our assumptions that you give a body part and somehow it's still the person? It's just so, our technology has put us in this situation, so, yeah. Yeah, sorry, Andrew.
Circling back around to what we were just talking about a second ago, I read a book, I think it was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, called Proust is a Neurobiologist, and it's written by a neurobiologist who has an interest into modern art, and he sort of lists a number of modern artists whose, Virginia Woolf is one of them, whose work and writing anticipated the revelations of scientific neurobiology in the 20th century, 50 to 100 years before those revelations were made. And it's not a super academic book, but it might have some interesting ideas, but there is this lot of this sense of the intuitive knowledge being then borne out by scientific process, and the ideas we're discussing here seem to laden with that kind of sense of connection and these realities which there's no scientific foundation for, quote unquote, until it's potentially discovered that, oh, actually there is, and now we can address it. And some of the failure of the modern that we speak of is connected with, segregating which ideas are acceptable and which are not.
Right.
That's an interesting book because it's a very beautiful book, and it's it's a huge problem because he's gone through this whole process of sort of discreditation because he admitted that he made up a lot of the stuff in it. But to me, what's interesting about that is that it rings profoundly true to me, what he says, and it feels like he had to fabricate to make it, like it's more complicated than just he made it up.
Right.
But it's interesting because it was a big scandal.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the author of the book?
Yeah, the author of the book. Yeah.
What's the name of the book again?
The book is, Bruce was a neuroscientist. And is Jonathan Lehrer, is that the name?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, anyway, he's an interesting case because it does ring like a really powerful book that addresses some very difficult questions, and it's really, it's got a complicated status now.
Okay.
Colin Milburn also addresses, I don't know if any of you have read Colin Milburn's writing, but he also kind of looks at, he calls it nano writing, how much science fiction, from a different angle, science fiction influences the way that people want to develop technology. So the technology is developed in a way that the science fiction predicted, which makes the science fiction go somewhere, which makes the technology go somewhere, which makes the science... Anyway, it's an interesting, the nano writing that comes...
Well, we saw that with virtual reality. That came out of the helicopter war lab and went to NASA Ames Research with Scott Fisher, was kind of this little research project, and then got hold of by all these writers in California who decided to discuss it as leaving the body behind, which it doesn't. It works because of really intense surveillance. It became the story in the press. It's taken up as a kind of fiction, and then then you get books like what's this book like from Vancouver, Neuro, yeah. And everybody thinks, and it invents little taglines, so everybody thinks, well, that's what it means. You could put a scientific application in and says, I've forgotten now his term about plugging in. Everybody thinks they don't understand it, but if you put in a different scientific application, look at something completely different, the sort of fictional structure isn't there. So it's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think it actually kind of excludes some really interesting research because it's not fictionalized.
Okay, that seems to...
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine.